This is the London Fintech Podcast, bringing you practical insights and approaches, stories and inspiration from the innovators who are building the new world of financial services. This podcast is brought to you by NextWave, strategy specialists and solutions for financial institutions. Welcome to the London Fintech Podcast. I'm Tony Clark, and on this show, I'm privileged to talk with amazing guests about their stories of fintech innovation and success. Today's episode is a little bit special because the clue is in the title of London Fintech Podcast, because we're going to be speaking with the person who's probably played the most significant role in positioning London as a focal point in the global fintech scene on a podcast. I'm honoured that my guest today is Michael Manelli. Michael is the 695th Lord Mayor of London and has a list of academic and professional accolades that span industries and institutions. It's probably too long to list, so I'm going to have a go. So Michael is a chartered financial accountant, a professor, a government advisor, has written 4 books and is a noted economist. He started work in the Harvard Computer Graphics Lab, but has also worked in consulting, banking, and the Ministry of Defence. Born in the US, also holds Irish, Italian, and UK citizenship. So very much cross-sector and a global citizen, which has probably helped a great deal with throwing his arms around such a diverse city as London. Welcome, Michael. Did I miss anything out?
Don't worry about it. People make up their own mind. Always fine, Tony.
Good. Well, that's a good place to start. Early life and career highlights. I'm noting that there's been a lot of it. So perhaps if you could just, for the audience, bring this to life a little bit. And where did you start out in your career, and what's been your path to becoming the Lord Mayor of London?
Oh, well, firstly, I am what they call the late Lord Mayor. I stepped down 4 weeks ago. As I try and explain, I'm not late. I'm just a little tardy. It is the formal expression for past Lord Mayor, the immediate past Lord Mayor. And we had a great year there. But how do you get there? Well, I think you sort of get there indirectly. It's like so many things in life. If you were trying to get there, you probably wouldn't. But I never really dreamt of being Lord Mayor. Frankly, I didn't even know what a Lord Mayor was until I was in my late 20s, because it wasn't exactly a common term in the places where I grew up. Early career. I was just always a curious kid and somewhat precocious. And I actually had my first proper job. I was doing a lot of other jobs. Mom and dad really believed in working. So, I was a janitor, cleaning up things, serving dishes, writing for the local newspaper, all sorts of little things. But at 16, I got a job within a company called Martin & Marietta, now Lockheed Martin. And I never really thought about it. It was very much in the aerospace section, and we were doing guidance systems for ballistic missiles and also for some surface-to-air missiles. And it wasn't, I think, until I was in my 30s that somebody said, "So you were a rocket scientist?" I said, "Yeah, I guess we were." Which it just goes to show that being rocket science isn't really all that hard. To sort of undermine the phrase. So that's really how I began. That work led me, as you said, to the Harvard Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis, which was one of the leading labs in computer cartography. I became quite an expert in that. And in the late 70s, I conceived this idea that we could give the software away and provide the service, which I think is a bit revolutionary at that time. But in fact, what we're doing is providing data. And so we had 2 very large projects to digitize the world, sort of Google Earth 1980, and Google Earth comes out about 20 years later. And we were selling the data. That was the key element. This was a very large project out of Switzerland, and it was that project that led me to the UK. And we wound up establishing the operational component of the business in Cambridge. Here, and we did it bluntly for cheap labor. At that time, Britain wasn't particularly a great place to be. It was, very much the sick man of Europe. Margaret Thatcher had taken power in October '79, and we even delayed investing for a couple of years just to make sure that exchange controls weren't going to be reintroduced. So it was a very difficult time. Anyway, that project came to a very successful conclusion, and I kind of looked around and looked down at London, which I'd been flitting through all the time. And I read about Big Bang. And so in '84, I decided to try and get into Big Bang. Found that I really didn't know as much as I thought I did about finance, and made kind of a huge career switch at that time and went into the progenitor of your old firm, Tony, which was Arthur Andersen Management Consultants. today, stubs of which are Accenture. And I went in there really to learn how people were doing finance and management work as opposed to science and technical work. And ultimately, I decided to qualify as an accountant and a securities trader, and then made a complete kind of switch and became one of the partners and later one of the senior partners of what was called BDO, Binder Hamlin. So that was the career. And sometime in the early 90s, when Binder Hamlin itself was acquired, guess what, by Arthur Andersen in 94, I decided to move back into science and began working with the Ministry of Defense as the Director of Corporate Development. And my job there was the research side of the MOD. We had about 14,000 people in research in those days. And then I realized that the great thing in life was operating between the two areas. So it's always been science and technology on the one hand, and economics and finance on the other. We created Zien some 30 years ago this year in October 94. It was started, and I came into Zien full time really from about 2000. And Zien is very much a think tank, but it does a tremendous amount of work both in software development and fintech. But we also do tremendous work in economics and finance. We're probably most famous for three indices we produce: the Global Financial Centers Index, the Smart Centers Index, and the Global Green Finance Index. But that's only about 5% of our business. We actually do range across a whole variety of fields. But again, it'll be science and technology, things like low loss, long distance, high voltage cables, and it will be economics and finance. For example, a lot of our work over the years on the carbon markets or sovereign sustainability linked bonds. So it's been sort of bouncing between those two.
You covered a lot there. So a couple of common areas. So I also started with Accenture when it was called Andersen Consulting, and shortly after I left, it was came under the new name. And I always called it ZN, but maybe I should have been calling it ZN. I remember operational benchmarks that ZN was running on big banking institutions, which we used as a research input, some of the consulting work we were doing, 20, 30 years ago. So, really interesting. Well, personally for me to meet the person behind that, and just to reflect on a couple of things that were milestones for me as well. But so there's a strong theme of technology, science, data, economics running through everything. And so at what point did you sort of lean into getting involved with the livery companies, Corporation of London, and sort of set your path towards taking the mayor role?
Well, it might help the viewers and listeners to understand what the City of London is in our terms. The term City of London is used in so many different ways. It's a shorthand for, the financial markets. It's seen sometimes to be a local authority. It's sometimes seen to be boys and girls dressing up in robes and costumes and parading. And in some way, it is all of those things. But strictly speaking, the City of London is, and I really worked hard on this definition before I became Lord Mayor. City of London is the world's oldest democratic workers and residents cooperative. Oldest in the sense that we date back with a continuous election since roughly the middle of the 7th century. Our estimate is about 640 AD. We began electing sheriffs, and we've been doing that continuously. Later on, we added aldermen, then we added common council, then we added the Lord Mayor, which is a recent job from 1189, and we're still trying to figure out what the role entails. So there's that bit. In terms of workers and residents cooperative, the style of the City of London would not have been unusual to anybody on up and through the 18th century. Approximately 350 cities across Europe were run by their workers and their residents. And in fact, originally, most of the cities were run by their workers. It was the guild workers who, in a variety of democratic structures, basically governed their cities. So this idea that democracy is a recent thing and came via the nation state is perhaps correct if you look at the formation of the nation state. But as you looked across northern Italy, most of the German principalities, the Hanseatic League, the Low Countries, etc., you saw this self-governing system of workers and residents. Now in the city, the residents got the vote a few centuries ago, and we today have 678,000 workers. which is up from 615,000 just a year ago. I'd like to claim it was the last Lord Mayor what did that, but in truth, that's the franchise. We also have 8,000 residents. The workers vote though on a 1 to 10 ratio, so the 678,000 implies a maximum franchise of sort of in the 60,000s, and the 8,000 residents all have voted individually. But that is what the City of London Corporation is. And that drives things in a variety of fashions. So firstly, you can work out that the politicians are paying quite a bit of attention to the workers just on the numbers that I gave you. Therefore, the City of London has a huge business emphasis and has always had that. The second thing you'll see is long periods of time. Probably the best way to look at us is that we are a land value capture play. So we have just over a square mile, 1.12 square miles to be exact. And we need to make that as valuable as possible so that we can raise tax monies on it. We then invest those tax monies, proper investment, in the sense of we're investing it in the business environment, and we're also investing it in the physical realm. And then the third thing is we need to spread that wealth, we need to spread that prosperity around. And so we have a huge philanthropic arm as well. And those are kind of the three things, make the place valuable by thinking about what you're doing, and continue to invest and make sure that you're spreading that prosperity. So that's the background to it.
Yeah.
How did I get involved? Well, I mentioned that I was a partner in BDO, and I've always been concerned about environmental issues. In fact, at the Lab for Computer Graphics in the late 70s, I began doing some research on deforestation and the nature of it. A lot of work with setting up the World Conservation Monitoring Center up in Cambridge in the very early 1980s. So I've always had this environmental streak, and you'll see it in a whole variety of things that I've done on fisheries, on forestry, on the London Accord, etc. So I found myself in late 1980s being told, hey, you got the vote. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. Why have I got the vote in the city? I don't even live here. I live in Bayswater, so I don't need a vote. And somebody sat me down and said, hey, you're new to this. There's three things in the City of London. One is the City of London Corporation itself. Secondly are the wards, and you've got to vote here in Farringdon without. And the third thing is the livery companies. So I paid attention at that point, and I began to research what was the City of London Corporation about. And what I found was positive and surprising. For example, the City of London Corporation was the very first government to pass a Clean Air Act back in 1953. So it had been on this. Later, the City of London Corporation was at Rio and has been at every single COP. We're very passionate about clean air and about carbon. Now, at that time, which was the late 1980s, a number of people were talking about creating an emissions trading market to stop the big environmental issue of our day at that time, which was acid rain. People forget when acid rain was the big thing. And we were working on policy areas that overlap with the Americans. And in 1992, the US EPA decided that it was going to regulate the SOx and NOx, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide markets through a trading scheme. And we were watching that with great interest. And their prediction was that they would reduce emissions over a decade by about 25%. In truth, they reduced emissions by 50% in 4 years. And that brings us to effectively 1996. So we were now preparing for COP3, which was Kyoto in December 97. And we here in the City of London, in the community sense, led by the corporation, were very excited about the potential to use emissions trading schemes for carbon. And that was our negotiating position going in. And in December 1997, the world reached a global agreement that it would control emissions via ETS schemes. Now, this is often overlooked by people, but those ETS schemes had a bouncy start. The Americans left the system and still haven't come in with a trading scheme. We here in the city decided to create a shadow trading scheme, and began working with the EU in the early 2000s, and that was launched in April 2005 as the EU ETS. That ETS, the governments of Europe didn't want a central registry. You could ask why, but because they didn't have a central registry of the permits, they then began issuing extra permits. In other words, they lied. And in December 2007, everybody on the market worked out, wait, there are way too many permits here for what we're supposed to be controlling, and the market crashed. That market subsequently was revived and really has been functioning quite well now for roughly the last decade. And it's been copied. 24% of global emissions are now covered by a credible ETS scheme. Everywhere they've been introduced, emissions have reduced as a percentage of intensity of GDP or on a per capita basis. And that market last year was $948 billion. So the system worked, and it popped out of this tiny little workers and residents cooperative, which is based in the small central part of London. And so that's something that you can be proud of. And the corporation has a number of other areas where it's done things like that, but that's probably the one that got me most involved and began to realize the potential of being an actor with different degrees of freedom.
So this was you really leveraging the City of London infrastructure and organisation to really take a pioneering role on sustainability and emissions, before the turn of the century. So really very early on in perhaps the sort of wider global focus on the importance of sustainability. So really interesting where you sort of started on the journey. And I know sort of you look at the history lesson version of the way that the City of London is run, I understand that there are various offices and grades within the livery companies, and you can be alderman. I think you're also a sheriff of the Lord of London. At certain points in that journey, you step up, and then there's an opportunity at some point, and I think it's put to a vote to take on the Lord Mayor's job. And as such, you're then really governing that square mile, or slightly more than a square mile, and all of the institutions and the associations, charities, and the initiatives that sit within. I mean, is that a fair sort of characterization? What have you got to work with as the Lord Mayor when you throw your arms around all of this?
Yeah, well, if anybody ever thinks they're governing anything, they probably ought to have their head.
Okay.
In theory, there are many things that you do. If we go back again in history, and I'm afraid that one thing you'll probably pick up is if you ever wish to be a Lord Mayor, then learn your history. It is part and parcel of the job. But the corporation was approached by a certain gentleman in 1066 called William I, or he called himself William I. And he came up to the gates of the city, and we sort of said no. And we negotiated a treaty in 1067, the Charter of William. And we have other treaties with the Crown. So the city does have a tiny bit of a city-state emphasis to it. So we do have a slightly different taxation system with some control of our own. We've always had a militia, and therefore we have our own police force, just under 900 officers. So there are some city-state elements to it. The Lord Mayor, when he or she travels abroad, travels as a ministerial rank, with the assistance of the FCDO and the Department for Business and Trade. So there are a lot of unusual things about the job. It is probably the only independent element of government in England in what is otherwise quite a centralized system in England. So it's an interesting and different role, and one has to use it interestingly and differently. And really all that you can do is to convene people around a subject that you think is important. Now, of course, the skill there is identifying the subjects.
Yes.
So you need to identify the subjects you want to convene people around them. And then I typically say what you want them to do is you want to get them to contribute their thoughts to the issue. You want to develop some degree of consensus. From that, you want to develop some commitment. Then you want to communicate that message quite widely. And finally, you need to celebrate successes. And so a lot of what we do follows that trajectory, but it's the convening power that the mayor really has. You can't walk up to our schools, or you can't walk up to our police force and tell them to do anything. There's quite a bit of checks and balances. People are always asking, how do you become Lord Mayor? And I say it's really quite simple. You get elected. There are a few YouTube videos that are quite fun to watch if you know the city well. They talk about this secret society at the center of London and all this stuff. The funny bit about some of them is they're like 95% correct. They actually get some of the voting systems quite well. It is a bit of a complicated governance system. But as I often point out, remember all the great things modern governance has given us. And maybe there's some things to learn from a 1400 century old one. So to become Lord Mayor, strictly speaking, there are only two requirements. You must have been sheriff at some point in your life, and you must be an alderman. So we have 25 wards headed by 25 aldermen. Consider it colloquially sort of the upper house. Then we have 100 common councillors, therefore on average 4 per ward, although it varies based on population. And that's what the elections are about, are getting into those posts. Once you are an alderman, if you wish to become a sheriff, and you can, by the way, be a sheriff without being an alderman, you need to get the livery to elect you. So there are approximately 50,000 people in the livery movement, and they vote for the sheriffs once a year. Having become sheriff, normally for a single year, unusually I and my brother sheriff, because we're in pairs, did 2 years for a sheriff since 1228 to do that, but that was due to COVID. So we were sheriffs for 2019 through 2021. Now that you've been sheriff, that's fine. You can, if you then are an alderman, you can progress to Lord Mayor, or if you're what you might call a lay sheriff, you can go and become an alderman and also become Lord Mayor. That vote is a double vote. You need again to be elected by the livery, still holding on to your ward votes for your workers and residents. You need to be elected by the livery to one of the top 2 that they've selected, and then the Court of Aldermen choose from those 2 which person they would like to be Lord Mayor. Okay. So that's the franchise. And it's a little bit complicated, but then frankly, as you go through most countries and their constitutions, it is quite complicated. Yeah. And it has endured, and I think it's endured for a lot of reasons. And there's some interesting differences as well. So, for example, you're not running for an office on a party ticket. We traditionally, we run always as independents. So you're not bringing 50 of your cronies into office or anything like that. You're on your own. Secondly, it is strictly a 1-year position. And that has a lot of things that are beneficial. One is you can't become too much of a tyrant because you're going to go back into the hoi polloi, so to speak. And this is how the livery companies, all 111 of them, also run. So it's a city thing that you don't get too big for your britches, and you try and govern in a collegiate way. Third thing is, because you're not going to be reelected, you can speak quite candidly and honestly. I don't need to think what you need to hear to reelect me, because I'm not asking for your vote. I'm not going to be reelected. So there's a very different dynamic there on the governance structure. And I think it's quite good. It means you go in, you try and make the most difference you can make in a fixed period of time. You try and leave a really good legacy because you're part of that legacy. And nobody's going to talk about the Mainelli era. Mainelli only have 1 year, unlike, say, a politician who's in office for 8 or 14 years or something like that. 8 in America or 14 in France.
So, Michael, that's quite a nice link to your year. And I love that about the independence. There's no party politics. It's all about focus and delivery. And so when you take the role, you're in office for 12 months and clearly keen to make an impact. I think from your year, I don't know whether everyone does this, but when I did a little bit of research ahead of this conversation, I could see you put, I think, more than one school report up online. So you were measuring everything, and maybe that's the ZN heritage coming through, as a benchmark and a data point for everything. But you've delivered, 6 big initiatives. You've raised a lot of money for charity. You've set a lot of things in motion. So perhaps you can just tell us a bit about your agenda. And I think it came under the heading of Connect to Prosper, which is actually also resonates with what you were saying about the need to influence and convene people. And clearly the ecosystem that is the square mile is all about those connections.
Well, you're spot on, Tony. The theme was Connect to Prosper, and I was trying to celebrate the many knowledge miles that run through the square mile, which I call the world's coffee house. I might just unpick that a little bit. In my analysis, and I opened earlier with, it's a little difficult to describe what the city is. If you look at that city workforce, and I'll stick with the 615,000 when I came into office, there are a few things your readers might find interesting. The first is, it's about a third finance, yes, but it's actually about a third science and technology, and it's another third of education, arts, media, and culture. So within just 2 miles of the Guildhall, within 2 miles, so definitely not talking Oxbridge. Imperial College is too far out, and by the way, Imperial College was founded by the City of London. We have 40 learned societies, 70 universities, and 130 research institutes. It's
that's extraordinary
concentration.
Yeah.
And this is frequently overlooked. It turns up in Xian's Smart Centers Index very, very forcefully, where London is very clearly the #1 city in terms of smarts. Oxford and Cambridge are there, but remember that Oxford and Cambridge combined are only the size of UCL. So we tend to forget that London's a very intellectual town indeed. So
and the square mile isn't very big either, is it? I mean, we're talking about an area that goes from Temple to Tower Bridge, Liverpool Street, to roughly maybe the river or just south of the river. That sort of it, isn't it?
That's just it, yeah. And it's that intensity is legendary. If you talk to people outside of London, when they go to London, they're like, I just keep meeting everybody. Well, we have a temperate climate. We walk everywhere. We've got a lot of little alleyways and places to meet. We have a culture which is very open. We have a culture which celebrates all sorts of events. And you'll talk to many business people in fintech who will tell you that they can pretty much have a lunch, 5 times a week and dinner 4 nights a week for free if they don't mind going to some law firm or accountancy firms presentations in the evening. It's a very open thing, and much to be contrasted with cities where you have to get into an air-conditioned automobile just to go and see your neighbor, or cities where they are actually just kind of closed, or they charge for everything. London's a very open and vibrant space. And I wanted to celebrate those 3 sectors: science and tech, finance and professional services, and education, arts, media, culture, and shipping. 5% of the workforce is in shipping. And we remain the world's largest shipping services center by far, without a port. In fact, we lost the port twice. One to Tilbury, and the one further east to Dubai ports these days. So London Gateway. So we're seeing an interesting structure here, and it's always been that way. That's the funny thing. It's very recent. It's tech. No. Now there are some difficulties with this view of the world. One is a kind of, I don't see it that way. But over the year, I did notice people beginning to look a little bit out, and it's hard. Because if you go to the center of what we consider to be things, we have, of course, the Bank of England. We have NatWest and the Old Midland there, and the Royal Exchange and Mansion House. That's the center of our community. And you would say, well, come on, Michael, that's not very sciencey. Actually, I might point out that the Royal Exchange was the home of lectures from 1597 when Gresham College began. And it was also where the Royal Society came out of those Gresham lectures. So the science has always been there, but you don't see big signs saying, science lab, but they are there. And I wanted to bring that up. So one of the things I did last year was over the past year, was to do a lot of experiments. So we recreated Einstein's 2-clock time dilation experiment in 22 Bishopsgate. We actually put a whole bunch of modern equipment on the monument to see if it could have been used the way that Wren and Hooke thought it might be used as an observatory, and short answer is no, too much vibration. We had pollinator counts in the city. We did a whole bunch of things to show that this stuff is actually happening and occurring in our city, as well as the finance. But one of the things that was important on that was not to be gimmicky. And again, thinking about it, if you were in Jakarta or Rio de Janeiro or something, all these input numbers I've just given you about 600 and some odd thousand people working in various disciplines is kind of so what? What does that mean for me? And what it means for you all around the world is London is a solution center. Tony, you've been in professional services, so you know most of the courses teach you if you get the client to express clearly their problem, you've won the sale, assuming you can do the job. And so my job, I felt, was to get clients to think about articulating what it was they wanted. And then I realized that 10 years ago, the world, our client, modestly our client, sat down and laid out its 17 sustainable development goals. Those were the 17 problems it wanted solved. So we set out to, in the course of the year, celebrate the many knowledge miles that flow through the square mile, taking this kind of coffee house approach, which is that in the early 1600s, coffee houses began to emerge, and they were places where people just got together and chatted about the issues of the day. But so many of our institutions came out of coffee houses: Lloyd's of London, the Baltic Exchange, the Stock Exchange, Spectator, Tatler, the Hudson Bay Company. They all came out of these coffee houses, and so I thought that's a model that we should look at. So we had the problem set, we had the coffee house culture, and then to implement that, we wanted to do two longer running things. One was we held 25 coffee colloquies on the issues of the day at Mansion House. These were kind of speed dating sessions, 10 presenters, 4 minutes each, 45 minutes of discussion, 30 minutes of networking, and then get the heck out of my house. So that was one group of physical events. We had about 2,500 people, over 2,500 people attending those. Then we had a Knowledge Mile lecture series, which grew and grew and grew. And ultimately, we had 103 Knowledge Mile lectures on all sorts of subjects: quantum computing, gender equality, fusion power, everything was in this lecture series. Very supported by the livery companies. Over half the lectures were delivered by livery companies, showing that they are vibrant and modern and relevant. So those were and we had something like 125,000 viewers of those lectures, and they're still online. So that was kind of framing it. But I also wanted to get some stuff done, not just marketing. And so I launched 6 projects. Strictly speaking, probably I launched 4, but I'll just go through them briefly. The first is the Lord Mayor's Appeal has a theme, and my theme was mental health. And we teamed up with MQ Mental Health and later Oxford University and the Wellcome Trust. And we've launched something called Galenos, Galenos, and that is studying psychosis and anxiety globally now. It's operating in 70 countries, and it's being led by Professor Andrea Cipriani at the Department of Psychiatry in Oxford. And this has been a fantastic program to try and speed up mental health research globally and improve its quality. And I'll pause there because I can go on that one. Another one that we launched was Constructing Science. This was a project designed to help people who wanted to take Category B offices, many of them lying void or empty since COVID, and allow them to be converted into life sciences laboratories. But to do that, we needed to give a standard that planning authorities would feel comfortable with. That went faster than I could even imagine, and it's now become actually just the standard, and everybody's using it, not just in London. So it's good. Those were 2 kind of off the chalks. And then there were 4 that I was deeply involved with during the year. One of those was on smart economy networks. And for the fintech community here, this was to dig much deeper behind the Estonian systems, which are now the Nordic systems. So Estonia created what a lot of people call a blockchain system, and there are elements of that in it back 25 years ago. And they made it open source over 20 years ago, and it's the X-Road initiative, X-Road, I think X-Road.global. And the Nordic countries have a consortium called NIIS, and I wanted to get into that and see, could we use this for commercial transactions? And we've published 4 papers on it. and we're working on where we go in terms of implementing some of that work. And that was called the Smart Economies Network Initiative. We had another initiative on sustainability. Every Lord Mayor's had a sustainability initiative. If you were gathering the history I gave you, in this case, I was promoting sovereign sustainability linked bonds whose interest rate goes up if a government fails to meet its climate targets. Zien helped design one which was brought out by Chile in March 22, copied by Uruguay, and just at the end of November, the Thai government issued one. And these set a very hard framework. None of this target stuff. It's a hard framework where if you've purchased the bond and the government doesn't perform, you get a higher interest rate. So it hedges your policy risk. We had another element in sustainable finance on looking at could the insurance industry insure some of the voluntary carbon credits, and that has begun. And finally, we had a city carbon credit cancellation service, allowing individuals not to have to purchase unproven voluntary carbon credits, but able to go onto the main market, purchase as little as a kilogram, which is pennies, and cancel it, so thus driving the price of carbon up if that's the real offsets that they care about. And then the two that got probably the most attention were the Lord Mayor's Ethical AI initiative, where we had a course, an accord, and a consensus. So I wrote the syllabus for a course which 4 institutes are giving. We had 10,000 people take the course last year. We had an accord, which was called the Walbrook AI Accord, Walbrook being the address of the Lord Mayor. And that was signed now up to 38 nations, and they formed a permanent institute called AI Quality Infrastructure in Barcelona. And what they're doing is promoting the use of ISO 42001, which the course also teaches. And for those of you in fintech, ISO 42001 is probably the way we should be regulating AI. It's been in existence for a while. It's not a recent thing. And then we got finally a consensus where the International Corporate Governance Network, now they signed what they call the Coffee House Consensus. The Coffee House Consensus represents some 32 trillion of the 77 trillion of ICGN assets. And what it says is the countries where we invest and the companies in which we invest should be using ISO 42001 as their regulatory approach and trying to avoid local regulation, which will impede free trade. And the final one is back to my environmental roots again. We had the 695th Lord Mayor's Space Protection Initiative. This was really to do with space junk. Space junk is a very, very severe problem, much more severe than people seem to take notice of. We've been seeing mini Kessler syndromes. These are akin to fission events where one satellite collides with another, or a piece of a satellite collides, breaks off more pieces which collide with some more. It constituted the opening scene of a film called Gravity, which I think came out a dozen years ago. I always had this problem when I try and explain to the audience that Gravity features Sandra Bullock, and half the audience would pay no attention. Then I realized I also had to point out George Clooney. So if I did both Sandra Bullock and George Clooney, everybody remembered the film. Not a particularly great film, in my opinion, but nevertheless, the opening scene demonstrates this Kessler syndrome, or a Kessler event, as they're called. But they become much more frequent very sharply just the last 2 years. And the issue behind trying to keep space clutter-free or junk-free is, well, obviously you need space for shipping. You need it for aviation. You also need it for the 40% of sustainable development goals the UN's looked at. So if you really do care about the environment, this is the more proximate problem that you also need to solve, and much more urgently. So what were we going to do about it? Well, the one thing I observed was that there was no requirement, or there is no requirement, for what we would call a surety bond. So if you're in the maritime sector and you want to put a rig up, or if you're in mining, a responsible government will require you to post a surety bond, which is a bond backed by an insurer that says you'll do what you do, and if you fail to do it, they'll provide the money to get it done. So the money will be provided to take down your oil rig by an insurance company if you don't do it yourself. So these are the sorts of things I was sitting there saying, well, why don't we require this as a condition of launch? Why don't you have to post a bond that you'll actually bring the satellite down? and we wrote a paper on it, which went to last year's International Aeronautical Congress. Everybody liked it. In January this year, 6 global underwriters pledged $500 million per operator, which was pretty impressive. And I think that wraps up in a bow kind of what I was trying to say about London. One, being a problem-solving center. Two, the world cares about SDGs. We've thought about it. We've recognized that we also have another problem before we get to the SDGs, or as we're getting to the SDGs. We, London, have the multidisciplinary talent to bring together the tech community of satellite retrieval and maintenance and whatnot with the financial services sector and bring it together. And that's those became our space debris retrieval insurance bonds.
Wow, it's a huge amount there. So finance with science and technology as the themes. And prior to this conversation, I would not have guessed that Lord Mayor initiatives would cover such a diverse set of activities. And the education piece, the coverage there already was wider than I might have thought. And I think you unkindly said, oh, sort of marketing, well, actually, I want to get some things done. But the Lord Mayor's initiatives spanning, AI, space, sustainability, really broad range, and some quite big numbers at the tail end there in terms of what you've actually got over the line. So that solutionist mindset and saying, well, let's just make sure we deliver some tangibles, very evident in everything you just said. I mean, if you could pick, what would be your greatest, what would be satisfaction, what would be your highlight of the year if you had to pick something? I think there's a lot there to choose from.
Oh, there's way too much to choose from. And it kind of depends on what the question is. So, for example, we haven't had time and probably won't to touch on. I spent over 100 days abroad visiting 25 countries, and each one of those was different. So I learned a lot in India. We had some major diplomatic successes in China. I had a heck of a lot of fun out drinking in Dublin, as you can imagine. So there was a lot going on. We tried to pivot towards Europe. So normal Lord Mayor would do sort of 2 or 3 European trips. I did 9. And deliberately so, to sort of point out to Europe, we really are open for business, but we like you. Great receptions everywhere. So the trips were good. We had a whole variety of crazy events: abseiling down the cheese grater, riding horses around the city, and reviewing the honorable artillery companies like cavalry on horseback as Lord Mayor. Which is quite fun.
That's some good outfits, no doubt as well.
I'm not a great horseman, but I do love horses and riding, so it was good fun for me. So you had a lot of those types of events. You had endless, in a nice sense, livery company luncheons and banquets and war club luncheons. And as you finally got into it, it was good fun to do some of the speeches. There's a speech at every one. I wound up doing, and it depends on how you count it, but the team say 453 speeches is ones that they wrote down, plus all the informal remarks. So a proper speech would be sort of 8 to 10 minutes. So quite a few of those. So it's been a lot of different things going on. Of course, 2 state banquets. I hosted the president of Korea, the one who's currently having a few difficulties back at home, and also the Emperor of Japan. And those are quite notable and pompous. Numerous sessions with royalty. Fantastic. The mayor of Genoa lent me Paganini's Il Canone because we're sort of friends, and we had a concert in the Guildhall on Paganini with His Majesty. So it's just, you couldn't make this stuff up.
You can't. I was going to ask you about a day in the life of Lord Mayor, but I think it sounds like several years in 1 year, really. And I think you said 453 speeches, and there would have been a dinner and how many trips. Anyway, we won't go back over the numbers, but let's come back to that, because I'm curious about what you're doing now that you're not Lord Mayoring every day. Right. But maybe we'll save that one.
I did get into trouble trying to talk about the best. So somebody once asked me at dinner. We had something like 35 private dinners as well. Somebody asked me at private dinner, what's the best moment? And I said, oh, well, obviously it's the Lord Mayor's show. When you start, that's your first day, is a show with 250,000 people and millions on television, 7,000 people in it, and the praise and all the fun. So if that's not big enough, and then I looked across the table and I saw my wife, Elizabeth, and I was like, except of course for my wedding. And then I looked further down the table, and my eldest daughter was at the same dinner, and of course my eldest daughter's birth. And then I looked at the other end of the table, and the youngest daughter was there. And I learned the one thing you say is possibly the Lord Mayor show, with the exception of any family events, So yeah, be careful when you answer questions like
You've
that.
got a better answer for that while you were digging that particular hole. Okay, so let's switch it a little bit, because this is the London Fintech Podcast. Let's talk about fintech a bit. I feel like we have anyway, because we've been talking about finance, technology, and science. But London as a fintech hub, because you're a big proponent of London as a global fintech hub. So what makes London special? What are the London advantages on the global stage?
Well, I think several things. First is leaving aside the origin of the word fintech, which, if you're quite catty, you could say the government tried to coin or popularize the phrase to claim credit for creating it. In truth, as I point out, when I came to the city in '84, it was fintech. We were putting computers into finance. That's what we've been doing, digitizing finance for decades. We never thought the project would take that long at all. The second thing about a lot of the fintech stuff is many of the terms that are being bandied about as new aren't really new. So a token is effectively a database entry for a certificate, and we had tokens anyway back in the early '80s. If you want to look at blockchain, it's a data structure that actually dates back to 1976, and Xien's been running a blockchain since '95. So a lot of this stuff is actually not particularly new, but what makes London special is that we are much more comfortable at not having some kind of hard line that fintech is just about the digitization. So we take into account, things with sensors on it. We take into account what people are doing with the wider science issues. So I think that's there. In terms of where London's headed on fintech, our Global Financial Centers Index tracks that quite repeatedly for 2 decades now. And so we've got a pretty good view of it. And my contention would be that London remains extremely strong. And in some ways, we've got a little bit of work to do, but in some ways, I don't see us being dethroned anytime soon. Where I think we've got work to do, well, definitely in AI, and here it is to do with regulatory aspects of AI. Nobody has succeeded in defining artificial intelligence, and therefore the EU AI law basically embraces all of computing, and most of the regulations that have come out in America are very much the same. This could be the mother of all trade wars, when you can't trade with a nation. So if you read any of them, you really couldn't do something like you're an insurer and you want to send a suggested portfolio to a client in Connecticut, where they actually have regulations governing the use of AI in insurance. And you can't tell the difference. So when we say AI, those of us who are long in the field have always hated the term. We've always said machine intelligence because we see a distinction, but that's hair splitting these days. But most people, when they hear AI or AI law, they think we're talking just about large language models or generative AI. No, the laws themselves actually began before AI. Generative AI was a thing. So they actually do embrace all of computing. Europe is now struggling with this, and this is why I'm delighted that our push on 42001 has been received by 20 of the EU nations as being probably the right way to go, and that could work for us. We've got a lot of other things to do in AI, but I believe that we can embrace most of that within 42001 and the ethics of principalism. So that's the next thing. We've got a hard road ahead is on identity. Now, we can talk about digital verification, if you don't want to say identity, because that's a nasty word in Britain due to the fiasco getting on for nearly 3 decades ago. And I think we need to explore that. I personally am not a particular fan of an ID card, so that's not what I'm proposing at all. But one of the things we did within the Smart Economy Networks package was to produce a proposal for mutual authentication verification exchange. So allowing people to use their identity, particularly on KYC and AML, but to be able to use it with an indemnity. So for example, you, Tony, are a lawyer who've cleared me. I then go to an accountant and need to hire her services. And she says, I've got to go through all this stuff again. And I say, well, you know what? I just don't want to do this in London. Too much paperwork. Instead, she says, I understand you were seeing Tony. Yes. Well, I can use his paperwork. Now, there's some dangers in that for her. And so there needs to be a party in the middle who says, I will vouch that Tony is good at doing this, incredible. You can use Tony's paperwork. If Tony's paperwork fails to be any good, I'll give you, for the sake of argument, £10,000.
Mm.
You, meanwhile, receive £100 for having gone through the effort of processing all this stuff in the first place. And you think that's not too bad. You know, I got £100 back for doing the work anyway. And we begin to see a structure evolving where London becomes effectively a commercial identity hub for people who need to get work done. In fact, when I was sheriff, one of my big things was basically, if Britain's open for business, try opening a bank account. And what I wanted to try and do was to strengthen and simplify AML because it's impeding us in terms of doing international business. And we do have money laundering issues. I'm not denying it, but adding more regulation hasn't done anything and won't do anything. We need to strengthen it and simplify it at the same time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. So I think fintech is going well. I think we got a lot to do on AI. I think we got a lot to do on identity. I think we can go further. There's some they sound esoteric areas, but I do worry about the fact that we do not, as yet, our retail payments do not comply with ISO 20022, which is terrible, really. And as I was traveling, I found Indian entrepreneurs who built up 25 or 35 million customers saying they were coming to Europe. And as Lord Mayor, you kind of go, oh, that's great. So obviously, you'll be coming to London, won't you? No, I'm going to Paris. Why are you going to Paris? Because they comply with ISO 20022, and I can connect the Indian UPI system into that. Why would I go to London if I can't do it? So we do have to do that. And we also got a lot to do, I think, as a sector on financial literacy. And by this, I mean real literacy. One of the shocking things I found was that we, as a nation, do not participate in the PISA financial literacy tests. So you'll know the OECD does these PISA scores for reading and writing and arithmetic. They also have a financial literacy one, which we just never bothered to participate in. So I've been lobbying on that, and with some success. I'm not saying nobody's listening, but we need to kind of up our game in the sense of really getting with the international program, really getting with the international standards, and really being seen as what we should be, which is that global solution center, highly connected, sitting there at this world's coffee house. I don't think we could be sitting back all the time and saying, well, we'll join it when it all looks like it's working fine. No, we need to be leading.
Yeah, I think your GFCI survey had London in the top 4 on pretty much every category, but the sort of standouts, although it seems that New York, for some reason, was at the top of the list on all 5 of your major competitive dimensions. But London's leading on human capital and just generally on reputation and the city's brand and the level of innovation, which I think reflects some of the things you were just talking about in terms of the mayoral focus. What would you if you were to add to that? Is there anything that you would really highlight and say, but London's really got this. This is the secret sauce for London in terms of competing on that global stage?
Yeah, the one thing that when we provide advice to clients, as you gather, I'm a bit of a numbers guy, and I've been trying to keep the numbers out of my talk right now. Sometimes clients will go through 2 days of me, and at the end of 2 days, they're just, oh my God, please just tell us the one thing we need to do to be a successful commercial center. And I say it's very simple. Treat all comers fairly. That's it. If you treat everybody fairly, they will come. Now, as Lord Mayor, enriching on that, it did help to live the role for a year. It always does. You may understand it intellectually, but until you've lived it, you haven't grasped what it's like to have 14 meetings a day, every day, 8 clothes changes on some days, some things like that. But it did focus me on the 4 things I think have been London's strategy since roughly the middle of the 16th century. The first is defense and security. Now, we forget that sometimes. Nobody brings their money to a war zone. No, nobody makes deals in a war zone. That's it. Second thing is free trade. Third thing is that we genuinely have access to talent and skills. And the fourth thing is rule of law. And I kept coming back again and again to rule of law. And that is our secret sauce. Now, like anything, there are a few niggles and problems and some suggestions I might make. But rule of law is not just, as many people would tell you, oh, it's an independent judiciary. Oh, it's much more than that. It's an independent judiciary. It's people being aware of the law. It's about the law not being capricious. It's about the law applying to everybody. It's a rich system. And rule of law is actually what has made London. And that, in turn, is the common law system. So if you look at our competitors, actually, it's probably not New York. And here's why. The prevailing theory on up until probably around 2000 of how you got a great financial center was you started with a big hinterland. So London became great because of the Industrial Revolution. When America got great, then New York became great. And by 1980, it was very clear who was going to be the third financial center in the world. Tokyo. And Tokyo is running around 35th in our index. So that theory doesn't work. You do not get it. And in fact, if you look at the 40 or so little tiny states that run flourishing offshore financial centers, they're all common law, or virtually all. So it's a common law system that does it. So London's competitors are very much Singapore and Hong Kong, which have had common law systems for ages. Notice that Dubai and Abu Dhabi, who are doing well and compete with us, actually adopted our advice of a couple of decades ago to set up common law jurisdictions. So we're competing. And then suddenly, the Americans are going, wait a minute, New York is common law. Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, one of the difficulties in New York is getting legal certainty. You're trying to do a pharmaceutical deal between three non-New York companies because, you were told New York was a financial center. So you've got a Malaysian, a Brazilian, and a French firm, and they're all hanging out there. And then it turns out, but on alternate Thursdays under New York state law, the Apothecaries Association must advise on it or something. You genuinely don't have the legal certainty you think you do in New York. And my test for this is always look for jurisdictions where people do deals with no domestic component. So I've never seen anybody do a deal in New York City where there wasn't an American institution that they were trying to acquire or merge with or whatever the heck they were trying to do. Whereas you will see that in the 5 jurisdictions I named: London, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. And that's, I think, the acid test. And whilst we do compete with them, we do cooperate, but that's a longer story.
Yeah.
So I would say that our secret sauce is rule of law. Now that means, in a way, everybody's throwing tech on everything as health tech and all that, law tech. Law tech combined with fintech is an interesting and powerful domain, particularly when it comes into areas like AI, where we're able to process large quantities of semi-structured, semi-programmatic text for the very first time. That becomes quite interesting. When you have a contract written by an AI, what is its validity, or what are the outs on it? And we also have another, I think, difficulty here in London, which I have been working on with some teams. One of the difficulties in London is it's become very expensive to bring court proceedings against people. Now, I'm not saying I want to encourage court proceedings. There's a supply and demand aspect to that. But where you tend to see the most litigation in the evolution of a market is at the early stages, kind of by definition. And we see this in digital assets, because you're still defining things. You're going to make mistakes. You and I can be well-meaning with each other. We meant to write a contract, but when it came to it, I wrote something down that you agreed with, and it turns out that wasn't quite what you meant. I'm happy because it's going my way. You take me to court, you see. And this becomes very expensive. But there is an area in between, which is the use of tribunals. Now, tribunals under common law do establish common law precedent, but the judge controls the case rather than it being a full-blown legal set to. So if two parties agree to a tribunal, they can keep their costs down and they can establish case law precedent, which you don't get from arbitration and mediation, which are effectively behind closed doors and non-binding. So you'll get judgments early on in a market that will help the market evolve more swiftly and more rapidly. And we don't quite as yet have an international financial services tribunal. And that's something that I'm gently, with others, I hasten to add, exploring, perhaps even getting to the point we might lobby a little bit for that.
Yeah. Some fascinating insights on our competitive advantages, the rule of law there. I mean, legal tech is a whole different conversation, so we won't go there. We're going to run out of time. It is something we're looking at with our legal partners, friends of this show, the folks over at CMS. I know I'm looking very closely at AI and how that's going to play into the legal profession. And for anyone interested in the audience, Louis Glass from CMS was on this show a few weeks back, but we'll park that maybe for a future episode. Just looking forward then, Michael, and I'm curious, so you handed over the office, I guess, 3 or 4 weeks ago at the time of this recording. What advice did you give the new Lord Mayor, Alistair King?
Well, Alistair is a dear and sincere and old friend of mine, and I would give him no advice whatsoever. Stay out of it. Let him do his show. Now he's already in 4 weeks done a superb job, and that's the great thing about mayoralty. Everybody gets a kind of a 1-year marketing gig, but the enduring stuff is what I said earlier. Defense, free trade, talent and skills, rule of law. Alistair is really trying to bind London's communities together, which follows on quite naturally for some of the stuff I was doing on Connecting to Prosper. He's doing a great job. And I'd say just enjoy it. That's the hardest thing sometimes. You get a little bit too wound up about either the tightness of the schedule or your legacy or doing things right all the time. That sometimes you just got to chill and let things take their own course.
Yeah, and I think his agenda is growth unleashed. So I'm looking forward to that. I think it's time for a bit of growth in the markets. And what do you think is what's next for London and what's next for you? Because transitioning from, as you put it, 14 meetings a day and 9 outfit changes to something which perhaps you have a little bit more control over your schedule is a shift of pace, perhaps, or maybe it's not. I mean, depending on what you're focusing on.
Well, a couple of things, really threefold. I mean, one is it's great to be back at ZN. We do research. I like research. And our research tends to be quite pragmatic. So we're already doing some stuff on actual semi-provable AI. We're also working very hard on the identity systems and document structuring stuff that I spoke about. I've got a passion for seeing what we can do with mental maps, which I think I can do a lot more with. So there's a whole bunch of research areas that we are quite keen on. Secondly, with London, I'll be taking on the presidency of the London Chamber of Commerce, so hope to work closely with the fintech industry on that. I'll be doing that sometime in January. And I'm looking at some philanthropic roles and non-exec roles that I think could be quite interesting. So a lot happening for me personally. As for London, well, I'm with you, and I'm definitely with Alistair. It is time for growth, and the new government gives us a whole bunch of opportunities to see what all of us can do together, and I think that's very, very good. I would say we still have, I think, some hard debates ahead that we haven't quite tackled on the scale of the state in the modern economy and how we are really going to unleash growth until we address the percentage of GDP taken by the government. There are some issues there worth discussion. There are successful countries with percentage of GDP taken by government, at our levels, so it's doable, but we haven't quite managed that trick. So it's not just about expenditure, and I think we need to have that debate. I think we also need to have a debate about simplifying and streamlining. The detritus of life is increasing. We have all of these, wondrous devices, and all I seem to be doing is spending my time authenticating, rechecking it, resubmitting to the accountants or the lawyers my birth date again. I mean, we even had something the other day, just submitting our accounts where our accountants asked us to give them our tax code number and our VAT number, our company registration number, and they did that with no embarrassment whatsoever. And that kind of shoddy and sloppy behavior really shouldn't be tolerated in a modern country that's trying to go digital.
Yeah, so certainly, quite a lot of work in progress, and I think we're all hoping that there's significant growth ahead. And, having listened to you and chatted for the last hour or so, I get the impression that, you're still going to be very busy and you're going to be very involved, which is great to hear. I think you've achieved a lot in the last year, and look forward to see what's ahead. Michael, thanks so much for sharing the time and the insights. There was such a lot in that conversation, so I hope the audience agrees. And if they made it this far, then I wish you very best of luck for 2025 and everything beyond it. And I think I've certainly learned a lot, and I'll keep an eye out for you in the networking, in the market, and some of the initiatives that you've talked about. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Tony. It's been a real delight. And if any of your viewers want to get in touch, the door is very open. Michael_Manelli at cn.com.
So there's Michael's direct contacts. I'm sure he's on LinkedIn, and I know there's a website up there as well. So very easy to find, and we'll put those in the show notes. So thank you very much.